Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is General George Washington, or should I say, little boy George Washington, because today is George Washington's birthday, and to celebrate, not only are we going to be talking about the youth of this American founder, but we are joined by special guest Michael Troy. Michael, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Jason.
Well, now, when we were talking about doing another episode, you had mentioned, hey, let's do something for George Washington's birthday. And you thought, hey, why don't we talk a little bit about his youth? So, to start out, where was George Washington born and where did he grow up?
Yeah, George Washington spent his entire life in Virginia. He lived on three different farms while he was growing up. The first one was a place called Pope's Creek, which is in Westmoreland County. He lived there until he was about 3 years old, and then the family moved to, um, well, at the time it was called Little Hunting Creek. It later got a new name years later, known as Mount Vernon. But when he was 6 years old, the family moved to a third farm known as Pope's Creek, um, which had been in his family for many years. His grandmother's maiden name was actually Pope, and that's where the land came from. Uh, so that's where he grew up.
Now,
And
Washington is, famous for being a founding father of the United States, but all of these properties you're discussing, I'm assuming, were once owned by his father. So could you tell us a little bit about Washington's father, what he was up to, and their relationship?
yeah, most of them were owned by his grandfather as well. But yeah, his father was Augustine Washington. He was a fairly substantial landowner in Northern Virginia. He was also elected sheriff. Um, had four children by his first wife, who then died rather young, and he married a second wife, Mary Ball, who their first child of I think six from that pairing was George Washington. So Augustine, as I said, did pretty well for himself. His first two sons from his first marriage both were educated in England, which was a fairly expensive thing at the time. Um, so George was in a pretty good family. Unfortunately, his father died when he was 11 years old. George was 11 years old, um, and there wasn't as much money to go around after that. So George never really got the education that his older brothers did.
But George falls under the care of one of his older brothers.
He does. His older brother, the oldest son of Augustine Washington, who, by the way, was known as Gus, and I use that to distinguish him from Augustine Jr., who was another of Washington's brothers, who was known as Austin. Um, so, anyway, Lawrence was the oldest son of Augustine, Gus Washington. Um, he was about 17, 18 years older than George. So he kind of served as a surrogate father for George. And of course, Lawrence, as the oldest son, inherited the bulk of the father's estate, um, most of the wealth. He married into a wealthy family. His wife's name was Anne Fairfax of the famous Fairfax family. So, yeah, he was doing pretty well for himself. He joined the British Navy for a time during the War of Jenkins' Ear, served under an admiral by the name of Vernon, which is where he got the name for naming the state that he lived on. So, yeah, he was the one who kind of took Washington under his wing, tried to help him establish himself in life, learn a trade, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you were
And
saying. So I understand the Fairfaxes played a fairly large role in George Washington as a younger man. Could you talk a little bit more about their relationship with the Fairfax family?
Lord Fairfax was, I think, only the British peer to live in the colonies, at least at the time. He was the only person of that rank to be living in the colonies. It was a very wealthy family. They owned, if they weren't the largest landowner in Virginia, they were up there, certainly the largest in Northern Virginia. So they were a very wealthy and powerful family. And as I said, they were close friends with the Washingtons. They had, his daughter, Lord Fairfax's daughter Anne, married Lawrence Washington. So they were very close, and um, it was a very strong influence on George growing up. Lord Fairfax had a son named George William Fairfax, who was about 7 or 8 years older than George. And the two of them became good friends when George was a teenager. And I guess George William was in his mid 20s by then. But Lord Fairfax helped George Washington get a commission as a surveyor at age 17. He was trained at age 16, had a full time job by age 17, working as a surveyor. And George Washington and George William Fairfax went off into Western Virginia to survey a bunch of Western lands for George William's father.
That's amazing. So it was just their teams would just be the two of them, or would they bring a team with them?
No, they were part of a larger group, a larger team that went out and surveyed a bunch of land. Some of it was for the county, and some of it was for Lord Fairfax, land that he was speculating in.
That's fascinating. So George Washington, as you said, is from our modern day eyes still just a boy, basically, when he becomes a surveyor. And as we like to talk about on this channel, surveying was a great way for people who were of, we'll say, middling background to excel and rise out of their station. There are, first one that comes to mind, I think, is Rufus Putnam, but there are dozens of American founders who made their way up through surveying.
The real way to wealth, to gain wealth, to attain wealth in America was buying Western lands. That was where the money was. And being a surveyor allowed you not only to hobnob with people who wanted to invest in these lands, but it also gave you an insight into which were the best investments. And if you had some money to invest on your own, you could make a good amount of money by picking out the best lands and investing in them yourself.
Right, and that would be extremely important decades later when the Revolutionary War is about to start, because when they drew the proclamation line of 1762, they basically said, "No, you can't go have these lands you've been lusting after for decades."
Yeah, that was a big fight because Washington and many others already had claims on many of these lands, and all of a sudden the king proclaimed in 1763, "No, you can't settle on any of these lands." So they technically owned them, but no one was allowed to live on them. So that was very frustrating for them. And Washington basically said at the time, "Yeah, he said that, but that proclamation is not going to last very long. One way or another, we're going in there."
Right, exactly. Now, so he surveys for a few years, young Washington, and then he becomes, or his brother gets sick, and I understand they leave the future United States for a while.
Yeah, he was a county surveyor for a year or two, and then he surveyed on his own for a few more years. His brother Lawrence, as I mentioned, he had been in the Navy. One of the things he brought home from the Navy was tuberculosis, and it got steadily worse over quite a few years. And the doctor suggested that maybe some time in the tropics would be good for his health. And so in 1751, I believe, he headed down to Barbados, and he took his younger brother George with him, kind of to just tag along and kind of be of assistance to him, and also just to get some new experiences.
Right, and one of those experiences, I believe, was smallpox.
That is true. George had a long, kind of miserable trip to Barbados. I think it took 6 or 8 weeks to get there from Virginia, which is a long time even for then.
Yeah,
It
that's
really
how long
shouldn't
it
have
would
taken
take to
that
get
long.
to Europe, if I'm not
Yeah, you could
mistaken.
get to England in 6 weeks.
Yeah, what?
So that was but you're at the bad winds or the wrong currents or
Right.
whatever. It just you could never tell exactly how long it would take to get anywhere at that time. So anyway, they had a kind of a miserable trip getting down there. He got to Barbados. Um, they had some friends of the family who said, "Oh, you got to come over and spend some time with us. Don't worry, my wife has smallpox, but I'm sure it won't be a big deal." Um, sure enough, George gets it. He comes down with a very bad case of it and is bedridden for almost the entire time the two of them were in Barbados. He was supposed to be there to take care of Lawrence. He ended up having to need people taking care of him. Um, but he did survive. He had pock marks all over his face for the rest of his life as a result of that illness, something he was always very self conscious about. And many people speculate that he was also left unable to have children as a result.
Right. So they're in Barbados for what? About a year?
It was a few months. It
A
wasn't
little less?
maybe
Yeah.
like
So
5, 6 months, something like that.
right. So they come home from Barbados, and he's still, I mean, what, 20 years old at this point, or approximately. So,
Yeah.
what happens when George Washington returns to Virginia?
Well, another major event in his life is the fact that his brother Lawrence dies. Only a few months after the two of them returned from Barbados. He really never got better from tuberculosis, and he passed away. Um,
Right, because like we were saying, Lawrence was the head of the family at this point. Decades later, George Washington would be commander in chief of the army, but had Lawrence survived, it's a big what if, but Washington wouldn't have even been commander in chief of his family, so to speak.
no, and in fact, after Lawrence died, his older George's older brother Austin Washington was the oldest son, and he actually took over most of the estate. Lawrence's wife and children still retained their land, and that included Mount Vernon and a few other things. Um, but yeah, I mean, Washington um, kind of stepped up at that point and started managing some of Lawrence's properties for his widow, Anne Fairfax, or Anne Washington at that time,
Right.
um,
And
and was starting to help out with her children and all that sort of thing. And he actually ended up leasing Mount Vernon from his sister-in-law, and they lived there as tenants for a few years until she conveniently died, and her children also died, and Washington ended up inheriting Mount Vernon from his brother's family.
right, so just to put a wrap up on that, George Washington lost a lot of people in his life as a very young man. I mean, he's still at this point, what, in his early to mid 20s?
Yeah.
When all these people are passing away, and death was more common back then. Obviously, the infant mortality rate was extremely high, but even losing this many people who were already adults is a little bit uncommon, I would say, even for them.
It was sadly not even that uncommon at the
Yeah,
time.
I mean, yeah, I know.
It
As
was
soon as I said
you you
it,
you were really you were really beating the odds if you made it to age 25, and if you made it to age 40 or 50, gosh, that was rarefied air.
right,
Washington, as I said, had 9 brothers and sisters, and I believe only one of them was still alive when he died at age 60, and most of his brothers and sisters were younger than him.
right.
Um, so it,
I mean, most a lot. Never mind.
yeah, I was going to say, I mean,
I know
dying at a young
several of
age
them
was a
lived
very
through
common thing.
the war. They lived long enough to make it through the Revolution.
Yeah.
Not mistaken, several of his brothers moved to, like, I think what is now we consider West Virginia. At that time was Western Virginia.
Yeah.
Well, very
Yeah, he
interesting.
had he had a few younger brothers. I'm trying to remember all their names now. Sam and
Yeah, I had written an article about them. There's a lot of them.
yeah,
And then the one sister, if I'm not mistaken, it's the sister who lives to see him become president. Um, and her
yeah,
name eludes me now too. I think her husband was a shopkeeper in Virginia. It might have been, I want to say Williamsburg. I don't remember particularly, but
could be.
so,
He had, I think it was his sister Jane who lived that long.
yeah, like the
He had a
only
few
girl
others,
lived the longest. Great.
but
So,
yeah.
Michael, is there anything else about President or young George Washington's early life that you'd like to add? You think people might want to know about?
Well, it's unfortunate that the few stories we have don't really have much basis in fact. I mean, everybody knows the cherry tree story,
Right.
um, which everybody kind of assumes was made up by Parson Weems. Parson Weems actually went out and interviewed a bunch of people, which was not exactly as rigorous as we might do today. He was just kind of chatting with friends and family, and
Right.
they kind of told him these stories, and he may have embellished them a bit. There may have been some basis in fact for them, but we just don't know for sure. One of the things everybody seemed to say about young George Washington was that he was a very powerful man. He was a very strong boy, very muscular, very active, and an amazing horseman. There's a story about him actually riding a horse to death while he was trying to break it for his mother, um, which is it's another story that was passed on by Parson Weems, but one that was confirmed by a few other family members, so maybe true.
Right.
But he was a very rough and tumble kid. He spent most of his life, as I said, in the western frontier as a surveyor. He lived a very a rough life, and although he tried to show himself to be a refined gentleman that he became later in life, that was not his experience as a young man.
Right. He's got that little bit of Teddy Roosevelt in him. If we can jump away
Yeah.
from the revolution for a minute.
Well, Roosevelt always embraced it. I think Washington always wanted to kind of hide from his rough and tumble past. He never wanted to admit to it. He always wanted to be seen as a gentleman, be seen.
Right.
Lord Fairfax was his role model, a man who, you know, was a leader, a natural leader, but lived a life of leisure and had everybody else do the work for him.
Yeah, a little bit stuffy.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, sure, it's been a pleasure.
Founder fans, again, big thanks to Michael Troy. If you're not familiar, he hosts the American Revolution podcast, which you can find through the link in the description below. It is one of my favorite ways to consume the American Revolution. We are extremely grateful he was here. I am extremely grateful that you watched this episode. If you like this, definitely subscribe and hit like. We put out videos about the American Revolution 6 days a week. So thanks again, and we'll be back with another Founder for you tomorrow.